If it's hump day, it's hemp day. Welcome to this week's episode. I'm Robert Colangelo with Hemplet Farms, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's webinar. The purpose of this event is to exchange reliable, trustworthy information and share experiences with like-minded professionals in the Midwest hemp community so that we can all learn and prosper in this new emerging market. This is a volunteer effort and a labor of love, and it's been led by Piper Hemplet, Soil and Water Conservation District, and Jamie Campbell, the Midwest Hemp Council. If you're not a member of the Midwest Hemp Council, I strongly urge you to become a member if you're doing business in the Midwest. Today's session is focused on the hemp market. If you're doing business in the hemp market, you need visibility into the future so that we can all make better decisions. Wouldn't it be good to understand the size of the hemp market, what the regulatory environment's like, where spot pricing is for the different components, and what the supply and demand curve looks like for hemp? Today's speaker is RJ Hopp. He's Director of Hemp Markets at PanXchange. And PanXchange is a very unique company. They operate a commodity exchange that facilitates transactions, which really allows them to collect good market data because they have real transactional data. And they provide hemp benchmark prices per geographic area for a variety of commodities, including hemp. So I'm really happy to introduce RJ Hopp. We've been working on his presentation. I think you're really going to enjoy it. And he is going to provide you with a data-driven market forecast, which will include a look back and a look forward to see where opportunities lie in the hemp market. Without further ado, RJ Hopp, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Robert. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with y'all, be able to talk about the hemp market today. Like Robert was saying, my name is RJ Hopp. I work with PanXchange. We operate in a few different commodity markets, but we're here to talk about hemp today. Do also want to say one more thank you to Robert and the full team over at Hemplet Farms and everyone else that put this together. So we'll go ahead and jump in. So before I really get into the meat of today's presentation, want to quickly go over what I'll be talking about today. So first off, I'll start off with a quick overview of who is PanXchange. Then we'll go into, looking at the last couple of years to see where the hemp market has been growing, what has been happening, which helps to set up what's going to be coming in the future. Like Robert said, we'll take a quick break about halfway through to talk about any questions and answers, break the presentation a little bit. After that, we'll circle back with the presentation, looking at the hemp market currently and then looking forward, and followed by one more Q&A session. I guess last thing to note there is I do love these presentations when they are driven with questions, so feel free to type whatever in. Happy to talk about things that are included in this presentation outside of that presentation. So PanXchange at a glance. PanXchange is a market structure solution firm. We were founded in 2011, headquartered in Denver, Colorado, and currently we have 3 live markets. First one is East Africa agriculture products. It was actually our first platform that we launched about 5-6 years ago. Really, it was a proof of concept. It's been fun to be able to work on a more international scale. We're involved in the upstream oil and gas industry. I've done some other smaller projects abroad, but me personally, I'm very involved with the hemp market. Essentially, our goal is to bring years of commodity experience and apply that to these developing and nascent markets. Our whole goal is to enhance transparency, market information, industry development, supply chain efficiency, things along those lines. And I guess the last thing to note here is one of the biggest reasons that we got involved in the hemp industry is looking about 2 years ago, we realized an immense lack of good information. trust between buyers and sellers. And that's really been a big goal of PanXchange, especially in the early days of the hemp industry, to help work on some of these projects and get the industry moving on the right foot. So specific to the hemp industry, PanXchange operates a physical commodity trading platform. And that's very key to how we go about and disseminate various information on these markets. So the platform aggregates vetted participants in one central location, only allow those that physically are involved with the movement of hemp on that platform. So there's no brokers or industry associations. It's the those that grow the hemp, process the hemp, buy the refined derivatives, etc. That allows us to come up with some great and reliable spot pricing data. That data is directly used in our benchmarks that we put out on a monthly basis. It also helps us to help implement standards into the market, looking at some of these other more mature commodity markets. When someone says yellow corn number 2, they know exactly the moisture content, the alpha toxin limits, etc., which is something that will come in the hemp industry, but it's going to take time. And being able to see where those transactions take place helps to implement those. Coming back to the market analysis side of things, we do provide a suite of spot price indices, and pretty unique to PanXchange. We view this as an opportunity to look at it on a geographic scale. Throughout the globe and even in the United States, the price of one good is not the same in LA versus in Hong Kong, and view that as the exact same way in the hemp industry. So currently we distribute 5 biomass benchmarks. Colorado, Oregon, and Kentucky is where we started with, and then have recently expanded to also include the Northeast region and then the Great Plains, which includes a lot of the Midwest states, and then coming out west into Montana and North Dakota. We also cover refined products, so looking at winterized crude oil, full and broad spectrum distillate, CBD isolate, also look at smokable flour, minor cannabinoids, things along those lines. And once again, the entire goal of this is to provide objective industry analysis. We pull from proprietary and public data and really try to highlight these emerging trends and opportunities in the market. And one other thing to note is that although a lot of the talk in the industry has been cannabinoid focused, me being someone that comes from a commodity background, extremely excited about the industrial side, and that's been something that we've spent a lot of time on and will be closely following as that sector of the market continues to develop. Last thing to note here is that for anybody that's interested in how we gather these prices, happy to talk to people after the fact or during this presentation. But we also have our methodology posted online for anybody that's interested in diving in as to exactly how we formulate things. So now I want to take a few minutes to go over what has happened over the last couple of years, what has driven the hemp market to be where it is at today. If I were to summarize the 2018-2019 years, it's a period of massive growth and expansion within the market. Just looking at some of the high-level data, licensed hemp producers grew immensely from about 3,500 to almost 17,000 in the course of 2 calendar years. The number of states that grew hemp increased dramatically as well, going from 21 to 34 states. Acres planted also grew immensely, going from about 78,000 to about 230,000 acres planted. Granted, not all of that made it to the market, but it helps to illustrate how much expansion was in this market. A period of true unprecedented growth. And at the same time, because of this growth, we have seen a very sharp change in the prices that we're seeing in the market today. Looking about a year ago, we were looking at a pricing matrix of about $3.50 to $4.50 per percentage point, which I'm going to dive into this more in a few slides, but helps to paint the picture that what was going on a couple years ago, even a few months ago, isn't necessarily the same going forward, which really a point that I'm trying to make is the hemp market moves so fast, it's imperative to stay in tune with what's going on. It's been something that me and my team feels like there's new thing every single day. And those little developments really add up in changing to where the market is at. Last thing I want to talk about is that the hemp market was developing and is still developing. There are a lot of there's a lot of bottlenecks that were showing up in the industry at this time. Lack of drying capacity, processing capacity, being able to transport hemp from one state to another. This period also had a lot of industry speculation, investor speculation. And one of these big things that's happening currently, not to jump ahead too much, but a lot of this Canadian money, if you will, money from the marijuana side that was flowing into the hemp industry helped to get that initial push into acres planted over 200,000 acres. But at this point, a lot of that has dried up in terms of where the economy is at and previous investments. Last thing I want to touch on is that this market does have a lack of standardization, clear regulatory framework, which is absolutely a hurdle for the industry at this time. Talking to certain producers and processors, there's a litany of names that people use to describe these products. People care about different things, getting down into the extraction method, et cetera, which over time, that will naturally shake out. However, the lack of standardization and also the regulatory framework has created some unknowns in the industry going forward. So a lot of this is that, if I were to make a comparison here, corn markets took hundreds of years to develop where they are at today. The hemp industry is consolidating those 100 years into a matter of a few months. So there's going to be additional hurdles that pop up, but really the tumultuous nature of how this market is developing is due to this extremely sped up expansion of the market. So before I get into the market today, I want to quickly touch on this slide here. So this slide was actually developed by our CEO, Julie Lerner, CEO of PanXchange. And she spent a ton of time in various different markets, starting in energy trading, looking at sugar, East Africa with PanXchange. And we started to come to the conclusion that these commodity markets develop with a similar fashion over and over again. And this outlines how we see commodity markets developing. Ultimately, it shows the progression of how markets transform from a small niche market into established and liquid markets. So where do we sit today? If I were to put us as the hemp market today, I'd say that we are between really two of these steps, seeing influences of both of them in terms of oversupply in the market and then seeing vertical integration and mergers and acquisitions within the space. To drill into this a little bit more, I want to make a quick side note. It was interesting to me when I first started looking at the hemp industry, where a lot of these firms did set out originally to be vertically integrated. You hear seed to sale, soil to oil, all of these different phrases to say that a company controls everything, but that's not necessarily the normal way that companies expand their offerings. In my opinion, the way to become vertically integrated is to find your niche. To make a parallel to some of the other big ag companies in the world, Cargill didn't become the biggest private commodity company in the world by setting out and saying that they were going to be in the seed game, they were going to produce, they were going to handle logistics, do refining, all of this kind of stuff. But they found their niche and then expanded naturally. So at this point, it's very apparent, especially with today's prices, that oversupply has influenced where we're at in the market today. But also looking towards that fourth step, if you will, with vertical integration, in mergers and acquisitions that's absolutely happening in the market. For those that follow it or don't follow it, there's been a string of mergers and acquisitions within the space, which is good. It allows these companies that have found their niche and have found the one thing that they do really well to utilize those profits and expand naturally. Big one a couple of weeks ago was Aurora Cannabis, who actually bought a consumer line of CBD products. So being able to take their cultivation knowledge from marijuana, apply it to hemp, and be able to improve that supply chain. So overall, if I were to summarize what we're going through right now, we're in a period of oversupply. I believe the market is starting to react with that, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. But it really follows this oversupply. People find their specialization and then expand after that, where they can capitalize and not have to worry about scraping pennies from growing, from processing, logistics, etc. So that wraps up kind of the first portion of this presentation. Would love to bring Robert back in and address any of the questions that came up, or if Robert has any questions as well, happy to take a quick break here.
Sure. RJ, quick question. You had a slide where it showed pricing. Can you talk a little bit about spot pricing in 2018 and 2019 for biomass, oil, distillate, isolate, and smokable flower? Where were those prices?
Yeah, so looking at the specific data over the last couple of years, prices were very much all over the place. It's been interesting to watch the progression of this market. Specifically looking at biomass. About a year ago, we were transacting between roughly $3.70 per percentage point up to $4.70 per percentage point. And a lot of that, I believe, was influenced by where the supply chain was at. It was tough to find quality biomass where you needed it, and helped to aid to those elevated prices. To draw parallel to some of the other products that you mentioned, we're not too far removed from isolate trading at $6,000-$7,000 a kilogram, which is very much a thing of the past. Once again, developing supply chain where products were not as readily accessible. So that really influenced the high prices. At the same time, we had high input costs as well. I was flabbergasted when I first saw that people were selling seeds and clones for $3, $4, $5 a piece. Especially looking at some of the other commodity markets where you can get 40 pounds of seeds for a similar price. So I think all of that really influenced somewhat of the elevated prices that we saw today that weren't necessarily concurrent with A, where the full demand was, and B, what cost of production was, and falling in line with how things have progressed.
Great. Another just a clarification. You had a bullet point that said the industrial side of the market. Can you just embellish and clarify? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so when I talk about industrial, I really loop everything that is not cannabinoid focused. So growing hemp for the purpose of growing the fibers, hemp hurd, seeds, things along those lines. And that's something that a couple slides here going to dive more into. But to quickly touch on where that market was a couple of years ago. I very much view the cannabinoid side of the market to have taken off relatively with a lot more speed compared to the industrial side. And I believe a lot of that is influenced by what's going on with the medical and recreational cannabis side. Thinking back when Mitch McConnell first was pushing for hemp, I doubt that him and his constituents thought that the cannabinoid side would be the first thing to take off. However, long term, there's so many applications for the industrial side. It's still lagging behind in terms of the ultimate industry progression. But definitely something that we're watching for coming up here, especially over the next 2 calendar years.
So you mentioned that there is a lot of consolidation in the market, companies trying to build vertically integrated companies. What we've seen is that a lot of vertically integrated companies start out as well capitalized and then went bankrupt. Can you just talk a little bit about that of the ones that are going out of business and companies more specializing to what you've seen with mergers and acquisitions?
Yeah, and it's a tough topic to talk about. I hate to see when companies do declare for bankruptcy. Especially clients and friends in the industry that haven't had as much fortune. But to really drill down on that question, it is extremely expensive to be cost competitive at every single step going through. Where if I'm talking to clients, especially in some of the early days, I highly recommend that a company starts off and sets out to be the best at one sector, whether that is growing hemp, whether that's just drying hemp, processing from biomass to crude oil. There's obvious incentives, especially when you see some of the spreads in prices of, okay, I can get a little bit of money here, a little bit of money here, a little bit of money here. But when you're that stretched out, and to circle back to what you were saying about being well capitalized, that money goes quick. And I think that we are seeing the effects of that in the market right now. So I really do advocate that the vertical integration isn't something that you can set out to be from day one. Rather, it's a natural progression in a market force, if you will.
Thanks. So a couple of more questions is there's a lot of information out there that's required, from regulatory to pricing to compliance with state regulations. In addition to PanXchange, how do you recommend that people stay in tune with the hemp market?
Yeah, it's a tough one because things do change so much. And if I were to give a recommendation in terms of how to stay in tune, there's a lot of great sources. I'd be remiss if I didn't plug our own source in terms of the report that we put out. But there are some great newsletters and other things to follow. One thing that I like to follow from the regulatory and legislative side is Marijuana Moment, where a lot of the stuff is focused around the recreational and medical cannabis markets. However, they do cover hemp. Hemp Industry Daily is another great source. They really cover a wide array of things. So kind of my routine personally is when I'm sitting down for coffee in the morning, I'll look through the couple newsletters that I follow, read a couple articles, and then kind of circle back to it at the end of the day. Because one thing I've noticed, go on vacation and I feel like I come back 7 days later and the landscape's completely different. So yeah, subscribing to newsletters, there's a lot of great free sources out there. PanXchange provides some free stuff on the website, and then being able to actually subscribe to some of these newsletters where we have analysts that aggregate all of this kind of stuff and put it in one easily digestible place.
Let's talk about the back end. Is with all this oversupply of hemp in the marketplace, why haven't consumer prices gone down?
So that's a really interesting question, and I'm glad you brought it up. So a few months ago, I was playing around with some data on a spreadsheet, looking at how prices have changed from biomass, looking at crude oil, distillate, isolate, et cetera, where we have seen a depression of the raw products if we were to group all of that together. Looking at the consumer side, it's a really interesting thing because the prices really haven't started to come down. And for me, philosophically, I believe that a lot of if we were just to take CBD tinctures as one product to talk about it in a broad stroke, they're cost restrictive. I mean, it's expensive to buy a tincture and consume it every single day. Where that's a lot of where these demand forecasts that you'll see on the internet really point to of, all right, you have X amount of people consuming 25 to 30 milligrams a day. especially where the general economy is at today, it's restrictive, and we'll be getting into this again in a couple slides, but I think that there's opportunity for lower cost consumer goods. The margins are absolutely there, but also at the same time, if companies can make that money, it's in their interest. It's the whole point of running a business. So I think that the natural force of the market, you will see prices come down on some consumer goods and reflect what's going on in the economy, be able to open up that consumer demand to a broader array of people. But there is quite a bit of disconnect between the raw products and the consumer products at this time.
Farmers take a lot of risk here. They've got to pay up front for all their seedlings or clones. They've got weather risk. They got market risk. What kind of advice do you have for farmers to maybe help them de-risk their situation, understand what varieties to plant, and how can they be more profitable?
Yeah, it's another good question. In quite a few ways I could go with it. The first thing that I would point out is growing a massive amount, a massive amount of hemp and just hoping to sell it into the market has proven to be a tough thing for a lot of hemp producers. So rather than just setting out saying, I'm going to grow 50 acres this year, whatever that might be, I highly recommend talking to these processors that are local and see exactly what specifications they need. There are processors that can say, hey, my farmers in XYZ region have done well planting this, and that feeds well into what we want to do with it. So getting back to the lack of standardizations, being able to work with those producers, the people that would be buying it, and saying, hey, what do I need to do so that I can sell this, is a big help. The other thing too, and granted, we are a little bit later in the planting season, so if we're talking 2 months ago in terms of looking at genetics, it's really important to look at the data. We've seen such a massive explosion of seed providers over the last 12 months. Looking a year ago, there was a perceived seed shortage in the market. It was tough to find them, and that helped to aid to the elevated prices that we saw. But just being able to procure the seeds isn't enough. I'd highly recommend to have these conversations, if you're able to actually go out to the facility and talk to these companies, because I see a huge difference between a company that had a field seed out last year and say, hey, we're going to transition, just make more seeds, versus some of these companies out there that have hired geneticists from Canada, from Europe, done years of testing and have the data to back it up. Seed expenditures is a massive part of the equation for the production side, and being able to back that up as these plants have been grown for X amount of years. This is the pounds that I can expect, the yields I can expect, and location specific too. The same strain of cherry wine performs differently in Colorado versus Kentucky. And then taking all of that data in and starting to distill it as to, all right, if I'm going to spend X amount on seeds, this is my labor cost. This is going to be my harvesting cost. And really start to break it down to where the market's at today and see the profitability of it. So I think that those would be the two big things that I look at in terms of, what are the costs and, the historical data behind it. A cheap seed doesn't necessarily mean that it'll perform well, but there also has been some good ones. So can't necessarily recommend one or two genetic providers, but highly recommend having these longer conversations, because it is a big expenditure and influences what's going to come out on the other side. And to not belabor the point, the last thing I would recommend is to look at some of these crop insurance options. That's new for this year. Looking at last year, There is some big hailstorms out in Oregon that wiped out fields, and being able to mitigate some of that risk will absolutely help, but still have to come back to that cost, where a lot of people that I've talked to haven't necessarily insured their entire plot, but have figured out, all right, if I insure half of it, that cost works under my pricing structure, and helps to alleviate some of the risk if I do get a hailstorm, or we have a hurricane, or there's weeks of a bunch of moisture, and so things along those lines I'd recommend.
I've got a few more questions. I'm going to hold them off. You might hit them in the second half of your presentation, and if not, I will ask them at the end. So if you'd like to proceed, and thanks for your feedback.
Absolutely. Awesome. So for the second portion of this presentation, we're going to be specifically looking at where the hemp market is today and then looking beyond. So this particular slide was something that I originally thought about taking out of this presentation, but I think it touches on some of the things that we were previously talking about and does a good job of foreshadowing in terms of some of the later points that I want to make. So this specific data was published in late April by PanXchange, and we were sitting at home during COVID, talking as a group of what is the production going to look like for this next year. A lot of people have battled the effects of oversupply. Is the market going to react? Are we going to see another massive increase as we did the last couple of years? And the numbers were stark when we started to reach out to the Department of Agriculture, state-specific offices, and ask them what the trends in licensing were. So in this chart specifically, we saw some huge numbers in terms of some of the historical hemp producing states. The number that specifically stuck out to me was Colorado, that at the time of the publication was down 83%, which having a couple months to look back on it, I think a lot of it was impacted by the onset of COVID, as those numbers have started to come up, but it really started to change. Started to paint the picture as to what the market is going to look like this year. To drill down on a little bit more, the states that had a couple years of production history was really a mixed bag. There were some people that were expanding, others were coming down. But the big question was, what is going to be the impact of these new states? If we have our historical hemp producers that look like we're going to be tampering production, the big kicker is what's going to happen with Texas, what's going to happen with Florida, et cetera. So going to this next slide, this is some updated data and really starts to show the distribution of exactly that. So a couple points to make here off the bat. A lot of entities look at permitted acres, acres licensed, if you will, but that does not in any way correlate to how much hemp will be planted, and certainly doesn't correlate to how much hemp will actually make it to the market. But the interesting thing that I want to drill down here is that although we saw the rumblings of the production landscape starting to change, we are still seeing very much of the same thing where, I call them the established states, your states that have the long history of producing hemp still will produce about half of the hemp supply for this year. Under that 44%, that equates to about 200,000 acres licensed. We're not going to hit 200,000 acres licensed between those 5 states, but it does show that there would be a significant portion of this year's crop that will come out of those states. The interesting thing, looking at that second bar, we have about 50% of the licensed acres, but it's coming from 33 states. So similar proportion in terms of overall production, but a lot more states. And then the newer states, which was the big question, specifically looking at your Floridas, Georgias, Iowa, New Jersey, Texas, et cetera, is looking to be about 5.4% of the permitted acres. So kind of in coming back to all of this, I think that there is a fundamental change in the market compared to 2018 and 2019, where the mindset is changing on both the production side and on the processing side, to look at what's going on in the market, and be more reactionary. Looking back, if we were to talk about the previous slide, our conversations with a lot of producers was that they were going to decrease the amount of acres, focus on soil remediation in part of their farm, diversify a little bit, things along those lines, versus looking at 2019, where it was very much we cash out, we made $40 a pound, and I'm going to double my acres. So that, from my position, we still are early in the year. We are anticipating the Farm Service Agency to come out with their crop acreage report in about 45 days. And that'll be the first indication as to how much is actually planted. But I guess the last point I want to make here is that the licensed hemp acres have decreased about 9% compared to last year, but the amount of producers is up over 20%. So it continues that narrative of more farmers in the industry getting involved with the hemp market, but planting less on a farmer or a production per acre, if you will. So the next slide that I want to talk about here, once again, kind of aids the conversation that we're having in terms of that things are all over the place for 2020, not only with what's going outside of the hemp market, but within the hemp market. I've been saying that 2020 is going to be a transition year, and specifically looking at this graphic that PanXchange regularly updates on our website, you see a whole array of different colors here. And this is really getting to what states have done in terms of their production rules. So it's pretty controversial when the USDA production rules came out. There were some rules that a lot of people fought back on, and ultimately the government gave the individual states the opportunity to decide, are we going to revert to the pilot program? Are we going to adopt the USDA rules? But my big point here is that going forward, we will see this begin to standardize. I think 2021 is going to be a big year. I do anticipate some changes in terms of some of the sticking points with the USDA production landscape. Specifically looking at the DEA testing facilities where there's been conversation there, but you will see a lot of these states convert to the mean. Now, production isn't the only thing that you're seeing this mixed bag in terms of legislation. Currently what's happening is you have a lot of individual states that are looking at banning or permitting smokable flower. You'd see a similar map there. Even looking further downstream with how can we market these cannabinoid infused products, you see a mixed bag there as well. And kind of my takeaways from this, especially looking at Virginia, who recently published a bill on regulating CBD products for the sale, is that I believe that the federal government is taking somewhat of a laissez-faire approach in terms of the marketing of CBD products, much like they took the stance in terms of medical and recreational cannabis, where they allowed the individual states to make their own rules. We've been eagerly waiting for the FDA to come out and give some national regulations into how we can market it. But here, sitting about 18 months since the initial announcement, we still don't have a lot. So for the time being, I think that the production landscape in terms of the rules there will convert to a more broad rule set where you have a lot of the states on the same page. 2021 will be that year that comes in, but looking out further in terms of the marketing of these products, it's going to remain a mixed bag, and once again highlights the importance to stay in tune with your local laws as these do change. This map looks quite differently every single month that we publish it. So to continue on this conversation with the hemp market today, the big point I want to make is that we are really just in this third year of nationwide commercialization. There's a lot of things changing, and supply chains are developing, things along those lines. To come back to the previous question about prices, we've seen a dramatic change in terms of what the pricing landscape looks like. If we were to look a year ago, taking a 10% CBD product, you could expect about $40 per pound for that. Looking at now, we're down about 70 to 80% depending on the specific regional benchmark there. Isolate prices year over year have also fallen about 70%. Looking at some of these minor cannabinoids, I really put CBG specifically in the same boat that CBD was, last year or the previous year, where there historically has not been a lot of supply. It's garnering a lot of interest on the consumer side. Those that are formulating these consumer goods. Right now it's transacting at about $4 per percentage point. But I believe that, especially based off of the conversations that we've had in terms of producers, wanting to plant CBG because it alleviates some of the risk in terms of high THC testing, but then also the elevated prices. I see that we will see the price of CBG come down similar to where biomass has. And that's, really a factor of more supply getting in the market. But there's a lot of variation in terms of where CBG and CBD will go. There's processors talking about the ability to transform CBG into some of these other harder to find cannabinoids, which could levy demand and ultimately aid to prices not decreasing. But looking at a consumer side, I don't necessarily see people rushing to the store shelves to buy CBG infused products. I think that there's a point I'm going to get to here in a second, but there's a lot of disconnect in terms of the consumer market with just understanding what CBD is, and then you throw another cannabinoid, CBG or CBN, into the equation, where it is a little bit confusing for people that maybe don't digest this on a day-to-day basis. I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on what COVID has really done to both the greater economy and in the hemp industry specifically. COVID has accentuated supply chain disruptions. I was having a conversation with Robert, who was talking about just being able to ship products has been tough. Being able to source seeds, source fertilizer, seasonal labor, all of these kinds of things impact what the hemp growing season is going to look like. So that's a big thing on everybody's minds right now. But looking at the market today, and something that we did previously talk on, so I'll just touch on it quickly, but there is a lot of product in the market. And when I say product, I'm talking in broad terms of there is biomass that's in the market. Recently saw a news article of a gentleman that had biomass from the 2018 year that hasn't been able to move it into the market. There's a lot of crude oil in the market, which is also impacting the refined products in terms of distillate, isolate, etc. And that's something that the market needs to keep in the back of their mind in terms of going into this year. Is historically, we have seen a cyclical market develop where prices dip after harvest when there's a big onset of supply, and then tick up throughout the year as it becomes harder to procure. But this year we have not seen that, which really highlights that there is available product in the market right now. I do believe that there will be a preference for the newer harvested product. So not advocating that people don't plant at all this year, but something to keep in mind. So biomass has been noted to degrade over time, but for those that are looking at, on the processing side, a more cost competitive way, there could still be opportunities for the previously harvested biomass. want to quickly drill down on consumer demand in a little bit more detail here. So given what has happened with COVID, the economy, we have seen a dip in terms of general luxury goods spending, not specific to just the hemp market, but looking at some of these higher end brands that have seen sales stall. So that I think plays into the consumer demand, especially touching on the previous point that I was making about where a lot of these hemp products are priced right now. They are expensive, where you could argue that they are a bit of a luxury good where unfortunately some people are battling with unemployment is at all-time highs. So these types of things I think will play into the consumer demand. Quickly, also want to touch on brick and mortar stores because we've all been, pushed out to being at homes. Brick and mortar stores have suffered, but at the same time have seen an uptick in terms of online sales, and I believe that's more of a progression in the market. And to jump ahead a little bit here and expand on that, I was having a conversation with a close friend of mine in the market that operates a few CBD stores in the Southeast. And, he was talking about, what's happening with being have to shut down the CBD stores right now. But then looking at, his numbers internally in terms of, people coming into the store, how long they spend in the store. And the thing that came apparent to me is that he is saying that the average consumer spends about 20 to 30 minutes in the store. And a lot of that time is spent with his associates talking about, this is what CBD is. It's different from THC, walking through that. But the interesting thing that he noted is that although the 30 minutes spent usually resulted in a sale, he didn't see a lot of returning customers where those customers were looking to online outlets to see, all right, well, I bought this tincture for X amount of dollars. I can find one that's similar online that's a little bit cheaper. That points to that education is absolutely a piece of the equation, but B, I also see an opportunity for those consumer brands to build a network and a brand around it at this point in time, and don't want to take away anything from some of the larger brands that have done a good job in terms of marketing their product, but there is no Starbucks of the hemp industry in terms of a tincture or a bath bomb. There's no Red Bull where the brand is synonymous with the product. So absolutely see opportunities there. But at the same time, it's important to note the buying habits right now in terms of being cost conscientious. The last thing I want to point on in terms of consumer demand is regulation. I've said the regulation word a few times today, but it's important, especially from my perspective, where anecdotally, I've had great, experiences using CBD products. It's one of the reasons that, I've stayed in this market and will continue to stay in the market as I believe in it. And I think that one of the powerful things is a lot of the people that are in this industry believe in it too. However, it's also tough to market off of anecdotal evidence where having some sort of regulation, being able to publish studies and saying that CBD actually helps with XYZ ailment will help in terms of the consumer demand. But we're still in that tricky situation where we can't come out and say that. And I do believe that has tampered a bit of the ultimate industry growth that may have been expected a couple years ago. The last point that I want to make here in terms of where the market's at today, we've briefly talked about genetics and how the inputs are improving, but the supply chains very much still are developing. Logistics, being able to transport hemp from Colorado to Kentucky, for example, or vice versa, that's becoming more clear. The logistics, there's awesome companies that are being able to help out in this space, but it's still not the same as shipping, corn from Iowa to New Orleans to export, for example. And specifically looking at these bottlenecks, some of these bottlenecks get resolved and then other ones pop up at the same time. And, coming back to the conversation that Robert and I were having the other day, we have had some of the larger and medium-sized processors shut their doors for this year. So processing capacity looked like it was increasing. It would be at a good spot, but something that we're going to watch going into this year where we have had some supply or production capacity, I should say, come offline. And looking at this, once again, I stress, having these relationships. Hemp drying historically has been something that's been tough. So being able to reach out and, talk about these needed services prior to before you need them, I think will pay huge dividends. So I'm going to go on to the next slide here. So this last portion of the presentation, more turning towards broader topics in the market and continuing to look out further.
RJ, we have just a few more minutes.
Okay, I'll speed up here. So first thing I want to touch on is that ethanol prices have come down due to lack of gasoline demand. And to quickly summarize that point, we are seeing a bifurcation in the market in terms of ethanol and CO2 production. But the big thing here is that because there is a difference in these prices, there's also preferences in terms of what these consumers are looking at. My main point I want to make here is that going out further, I see both of these extraction methods coming back together in terms of being treated as the same product. In my opinion, if there's not residual solvents, the extraction method shouldn't matter. I mean, looking at your peanut oil, for example, they don't list whether it was cold pressed or CO2 extracted, etc. Quickly touching on what to plant, I see that the minor cannabinoids are going to become a bigger thing this year, but the industrial side of the market is also expanding. And to quickly go back to the point I already made, standardizations in the industrial side are not defined, and having those relationships with those processors will pay huge dividends. Last thing I want to touch on is that there are some people that are planting hemp in terms of soil remediation and maybe turning tobacco land into a certified organic land, where hemp plant is extremely adept at soaking that up. So it's not necessarily planting hemp to market it, but to practice those soil remediations. In an interest of time, Robert, should we just go ahead and do some more questions here for the last 5 minutes?
Yeah, if you just want to touch on these points in brevity.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of final points I want to make is that the market is standardizing itself over time. These specifications are market dictated. Quick point I want to make there, especially with the lack of time. PanXchange is working on a white paper in terms of specifications and standardizations. So if anybody's interested in that, please reach out. Last couple of things I want to point on is that, really in terms of brevity, you're going to focus on one. Futures contracts is something that people talk about. Very different from a forward contract in terms of saying, I'm going to buy hemp in October, but being able to actually financially hedge. So that's a project that PanXchange is very happy to be working on. Still a little bit of a ways out, but very excited that we're working on talking about crop insurance, yet another way to help hedge some of the downside risk. So it's a big thing in the industry that's not available, but going forward, I absolutely see that being able to be traded on, CBOT or CME or one of the equivalent markets there. And then lastly, just to touch on it real quick, how to get involved. Happy to talk to anybody that's on this call, whether you're a processor, producer, investor, ancillary services. And if you want to reach out, please send us an email at hemp@panexchange.com. We can also be reached at 877-917-9658 or on our website at panexchange.com. And then do have a couple more minutes for questions here.
So RJ, thank you very much. That was very content rich. You covered a lot of ground in a short time. We appreciate that. We want to be respectful of everybody's time. We end these at 1 o'clock. If anyone wants to stay longer for questions and answers, feel free to do so. We're happy to go over the time. But for those that need to leave, we're going to end here. And this also ends our hemp webinar series for the season. We're going to pick up again in the fall with everybody out in the field and farming. We found that it was just too hard to host these at noon and get good attendance. So we will pick these up sometime in September, October. We'll get a schedule out to everybody, and we will start to get tales from the field and have actual farmers sharing their lessons learned. We will also have Kia come back to talk about field sampling and testing your crop before you go to harvest. I think we've got some really good presentations coming up. But we appreciate everybody joining us. This has been a great experience. This all came out of COVID and sheltering in place and making it hard to do events in person. And we've had just a wonderful set of presenters. With that, I'm going to get back to some questions. RJ, it looks like you may have missed something on your chart, the U.S. hemp market. The today graph, why is Kansas not on the graph? We first grew in 2019.
To be honest with you, I think that was honest oversight. They should be in there. I think that had just an error in terms of adding the state name underneath. So
no worries.
I apologize for that.
Okay. Another question is, you mentioned several times that the industrial hemp market presents opportunities. What are some of the best ways to invest in that market?
How to invest in the market?
Into the industrial hemp portion of the business.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and trying to think about what I know of the general audience here. In terms of investing in the market, I think that how I would spend investment, if you will, in terms of looking at what's going on in the market and starting to develop some of these relationships. I know I've said that a few times, but I think it's imperative in terms of helping this aspect of the market get off the ground, where there's a few companies that are giving seeds out to people and starting that process. So I wouldn't go full in on it, but starting with planting a corner of your field with the industrial. I know that could pose problems in terms of the males, and I'm not going to get into that right now, but being able to start small and see how things perform and working with those ultimate specs, as some processors prefer a longer fiber or a shorter fiber or whatever that might be. I do want to stress that the industrial side of the market is still a couple of years behind. As this point in time, it's something that I put it as a 2018 versus with the cannabinoids, if that makes sense, where it's really starting to gather this interest. There's so many different products that can be made out of the industrial side of the hemp industry. So that's really where these specifications come into play, because somebody that wants to take hemp and produce a plastic is going to be looking for something that's very different for somebody that is looking to take the hemp fibers and make fabric, for example. So there's a bunch of different ways that can go. Anybody that's interested in it, I think that the feed industry has enormous applications. There's something that's going to actually be coming out with Hemp Grower and PanXchange, looking exactly on that too. So lots of applications, but because there's a lot of applications, that means that it might have to be grown, or different strains have to be planted to service those markets.
So we have a question from a researcher that works with growers. Can you direct her to sources to track prices for hemp biomass? How does she keep track of that with it changing so rapidly?
Yeah, so it has changed rapidly. I would say if if you want to reach out, specifically to me, I'd be happy to talk about how PanXchange can help with that. We do provide those monthly benchmarks, and one of the things that I strongly believe in is when somebody starts to work with PanXchange, that's a direct line to our team. So although you might be a subscriber to the newsletter, or if you're involved with the marketplace where you can see live bids and offers, we're here for our clients, and happy to have those conversations if that's every other week or whatever that might be. So if you want to reach out to me directly, my email is r.hopp@panexchange.com.
You mentioned in your presentation that there's a possibility that hemp might be traded on the commodity markets. To me, that's wonderful. Maybe you just tell us, what does that mean to the market, and how does that create more market opportunity by being recognized on a legitimate market and exchange?
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of the other side of what PanXchange does. So, we strive to provide the physical marketplace so that you can physically move biomass to a processor, for example. But those physical markets are what helps to develop the financial market. So I think that, exactly to your point, that being listed on one of these exchanges, and I just listed those two as examples. There's a lot of different options in people that we're talking to right now. But I think that it helps legitimize things, and then the biggest thing is being able to hedge some of that downside risk, where as a producer, you can utilize the futures market to help lock in prices and have less exposure to this volatility, especially that we were talking about with this last question. It is a little ways off. There's a lot of regulatory hurdles and things with the data that we're working with them on, but extremely excited that there is interest from the financial community. Hemp's here to stay, and these are some of the things that we'll develop. But does take quite a bit of effort to make sure that this contracts actually work for those that are in the market, and that's the big role that we're trying to play. And it doesn't matter if it's liquid on the financial side. If it doesn't work for the physical producers, I don't view that as a good contract for the market, and that's really what we're striving to help with there.
Yeah, that's great. I think that'll bring efficiencies to the marketplace, and it'll act just like typical commodities like corn or soybean and wheat. Last question. We don't hear a lot about sustainability when it comes to hemp. And can you touch on that? What type, how sustainable is growing hemp, especially when we talk about regenerative agriculture, good agricultural practices? Where do you see sustainability fitting in with hemp production?
So it's an interesting question. Just to high level go over it, when you compare hemp to cotton, as just one example, use a lot less water. You don't have to use the massive amount of pesticides and herbicides and different things along those lines. So it is sustainable. I think that as we progress as a society, that sustainability will continue to be something that garners more interest. But at the same time, I think that sustainability alone is not a reason for companies to switch supply chains from cotton to hemp. It needs to be price competitive. So it's part of the equation in terms of getting things off the ground. But if we're also just to look at like plastics, for example, if it's not cost competitive, you're not going to see that general switch to it. So looking at economies of scale, as these different pockets develop, it'll help, and it's certainly a selling point. But do want to come back to the cost is very important. It's the bottom line for companies. So I think over time you'll see it continue to develop, but and I don't want to discount any of the sustainability advantages, but I think that's a little ways off still.
Well, and sustainability has to make economic sense, else it's not sustainable.
Exactly. So,
RJ, again, thank you for your time. Great presentation. The presentation and a recording of the presentation will be available on the website. So you can see those on the slides that are listed there. I want to thank all of you for joining us for today's session. I'm Robert Colangelo, reminding you to be happy, be healthy, and be kind. We'll see you in the fall when we're back to making Hump Day, Hemp Day. Have a great week and happy 4th of July.